Hello and welcome to the Rambling Kings podcast, hosted by me, Callum, of the Embrace Historia channel. And today, this auspicious month, you guys have voted for me to ramble on about King David I of Scotland. And I'm very happy to talk about King David because he's actually one of my favourite Scottish kings. In fact, if you've watched the channel or if you've been a subscriber for a long time, you'll know I actually did make a documentary series about King David, although it was quite a few years ago, and if I were to do it now, I would probably double the length of that video, because the original was just over half an hour, whereas nowadays I probably would double it to maybe an hour or more, because I kind of heavily summarized a lot of it, or I didn't really finish off his reign as conclusively as I would have liked, but never mind. But before I dive right into King David and why I enjoy his reign and some of the various bits as I normally do during the podcast, let me just introduce you or reintroduce you to King David. So King David was King of Alba, Scotland, King of the Scots, whichever one you prefer, from 1124 till 1153. David was one of the many sons of Malcolm III of Scotland, another very powerful, famous Scottish king who ruled for a very long time. And when you look at the reigns of Scottish kings, they either rule for an incredibly short time or an incredibly long time. And David is one of those kings who ruled for an incredibly long time, nearly 30 years. In fact, Malcolm III had so many sons, it's actually quite surprising David actually became king. Malcolm had so many sons, 9 in total, that he could actually afford to have one of his sons go into the monastic life. So he gave up his noble title, not necessarily his nobility, but he became later a monk. But as it's the Middle Ages, your sons can die off rather quickly, and that is entirely the case, as Malcolm III died in battle along with his designated heir. The subsequent death and fallout of Malcolm III's death, and alongside David's mother, Margaret, who died shortly after Malcolm, although she had been ill for some time. So after the parents' death, both David and his brothers were sent off to England because they had an evil uncle who took the throne. I think I've heard this story before of an evil uncle taking the throne. Who could that possibly be? So after their evil uncle took control of the Kingdom of Scotland, David and his brothers took refuge in the court of England, who at the time, the King of England was William Rufus. And Scotland and England at this point had a temperamental relationship. Sometimes they would work together, depending on the king, sometimes they would clash. Malcolm III was very clever in the fact that he managed to raid England a lot and never really suffer any repercussions until the final fatal raid where he was killed in battle. But as this point the Normans had conquered England, they had territories in France, and that meant that William Rufus was going back and forth to Normandy quite a bit. So having an unruly neighbour in the north of Scotland, or the whole kingdom being unsettled and in a potential state of civil war, is not good for business, especially if you're bordering said country. Because it's not just Scotland William Rufus had to worry about, it was also Wales and, like I said, Normandy. And then what you find is, over the years, a series of David's brothers push out and then lose the throne, because they don't really have that power base in Scotland, because they're relying on Norman support in Scotland. And this is what David was known for, was bringing in a lot of noble Norman families, including probably the most famous ones, the de Bruces. And from that family, we get Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, the whole Scottish War of Independence. So David inadvertently created a sort of wheel of history to spin quite fast. But before David became king, he was known as Prince of the Cumbrians. Now, this is rather difficult to explain, so I will probably heavily summarize this part, but the Prince of the Cumbrians is rather a unique title that didn't exist for a super long time, because previously that area of land was owned by the Kingdom of Strathclyde, and I've mentioned it many times, but the Kingdom of Strathclyde is a very obscure kingdom where there's really not a lot of information. So how David got that is he inherited it. and it was also gifted to him by his brother. But yeah, David's story is filled with family drama. Obviously, I mentioned his uncle taking the throne, but what really elevated David, especially in the English court, was the fact that his sister, later called Matilda, because that was more of a Norman name than her original name, married Henry I, because obviously when William Rufus died in the Arrow incident in the New Forest, Henry didn't have the greatest claim because obviously he was a Norman and the Norman conquest was still rather fresh, even though it had been quite some time now. And he needed some legitimacy because his older brother was Duke of Normandy and he could challenge him for his throne. So Henry, very cleverly and very cleverly politically, married an ancestor of the House of Wessex, which Matilda was. She was the daughter of the King of Scotland, but her mother was one of the House of Wessex members. So by joining that union, creates a better claim because there's not really much nationalism here. It's more about family, it's more about dynasty, it's more about control of land than some ideology of nationalism that doesn't exist for another hundreds of years. And with this marriage, David's prospects were boosted and he became a sort of protege of Henry I, which aided David very well. But David was basically Anglo-Normanized. He wasn't really so much a Scottish prince because he wasn't raised really in Scotland. He was taught how to be a Norman knight, how things worked in England. So it was a little bit alien, and again, similar issues to what his brother had, where he didn't really have that power base in Scotland yet, because obviously some of the Scottish lords would be hesitant to have someone who was raised in England, because they might see it as that David wasn't King of Scotland, he was the vassal of the King of England, which when William the Conqueror went up to Scotland to deal with Malcolm III, Malcolm swore to be one of his men, not necessarily a vassal, but to be one of his sworn men to aid him in some sort of mutual agreement, which you find a lot in medieval history is those agreements happen and then a year later something breaks and then it has to be renewed with hostages, etc., etc. So that's a very brief, heavily summarized version of David's early life and his early kingship. So what I've decided to do this time, instead of going over the normal stuff, I've decided to implement something new into the podcast, which instead of talking about the video games, which I will talk about, in which David appears, before I started the podcast, I did go and read quite a lot of primary sources, because one thing I want to start doing when I'm introducing a king now is I want to start reading the first time they appear in primary chronicles. So I've got a few here from like Orderic Vitalis, John of Worcester's Chronicles, Henry of Huntingdon's Chronicles, but then also some Scottish ones like the Chronicles of Malrose. So I'm just going to read a few of those out first, and then I'll carry on with how the rest of the podcast unfolds. If you don't like it, please let me know in the comments of what you think of reading from the primary sources. So let's start off with the Chronicles of Malrose, which is a Scottish primary source. King Henry married Queen Matilda, daughter of Malcolm, the King of Scots, and the Holy Queen Margaret, and the sisters of King Edgar, Alexander, and David. So David appears at the end of that, so I've gone a bit further, and this is another extract which mentions David a bit more heavily in the Chronicle of Malrose. And David asked King Henry to grant to him the Countess Relic of Simon in marriage, and the king granted it, being persuaded by the arguments and petition of the queen. So David had possession of the countess and the earldom, and the custody of the children. Now I'm going to read from one of my favourite chronicles, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, on where David first appears. And after that, on the day of the 23rd of April, the King Alexander of Scotland passed away, and David, his brother, who was Earl in Northamptonshire, succeeded to the kingdom, and had both together the kingdom of Scotland and the earldom in England. With David being the Prince of the Cumbrians before he was King of Scotland, which meant that he was a vassal in England, but not for the lands in Scotland, similar to how Normandy belongs to the King of France and the King of England gives homage to him for the lands in France, sort of like a snake eating its own tail. So you've got Scotland, Scottish king giving homage to an English king for some lands in England, and then you've got an English king supposedly sometimes giving homage to a king of France for his lands in France. It's always a bit of a never-ending circle sometimes. Our next source is the Ecclesiastical History of England and Normandy, Volume 4, by Orderic Vitalis. Besides, David, King of Scots, was induced to support the pestilence disturbers of the kingdom in favour of the Angevin party, either by the perfidious invitation of the factus by whom he was called in to ravage the country, or by the oath of fealty to his niece, which he had taken at the command of King Henry. He held Carlisle, a very strong fortress, built, as they say, by Julius Caesar, and had placed a very fierce band of Scots in garrison there. Just a quick side note, Julius Caesar didn't build a fortress in Carlisle. Caesar didn't even go that far into Britain. It's too far north for Julius Caesar's campaign, so it's just ignore that bit. Then we have the Chronicles of John of Worcester, who writes, Thurston, the Archbishop consecrated at York, Robert, who had been induced by Alexander, King of Scots, on petition of David, his brother and successor, into the see of St. Andrews. The Archbishop had called in Ralph, Bishop of Durham, and one Ralph, formerly ordained Bishop of the Orkney Isles, to be his conjector in the ceremony. This Ralph, having been ordained without the election or consent of the lord of the land, or of the clergy and people, was rejected by all of them, and acknowledged as bishop by no one. Being bishop of no city, he attached himself sometimes to the Archbishop of York, sometimes to the Bishop of Durham. The source just goes on and on. It's mainly about an ecclesiastical matter in regards to the Holy See between England and Scotland. The next source is Roger of Howden, and he writes, In the meantime, while at the close of the festival of the Nativity, King Stephen was staying at Oxford. He received tidings which informed him to this effect. David, King of the Scots, on pretence that he was coming with peaceful intentions for the purpose of visiting you, has come to Carlisle and Newcastle, and stealthily taken possession of them both. To which King Stephen made answer, What he has taken by stealth, I will recover by victory. And thereupon, without delay, the king moved forward his army, which was so mighty, so valiant, and so numerous, that none in England could be remembered like it. However, King David met him in the neighbourhood of Durham, and making a treaty with him, restored Newcastle, but retained Carlisle with the king's consent. David, however, did not do homage to King Stephen, because he had previously at first at the Leyden promised an oath to the Empress, the daughter of King Henry, and his own niece, to maintain her in possession of England after the death of King Henry. However, the son of King David, Henry by name, did homage to King Stephen, on which the latter presented him with a borough which is called Huntingdon, by way of gift. You can clearly read Roger of Howden's biases straight off the bat. A glorious English army coming to save Carlisle and Newcastle, but then the agreement is that King David keeps Carlisle, which makes sense for David because that land he thought belonged to him, as it had belonged previously to the Kingdom of Strathclyde, and as he was Prince of the Cumbrians, a sort of mild successor state or title to that, King David felt he owned that land, and he did for a while because he made a lot of money off the silver mines there. Haha. The final one comes from Henry of Huntingdon, but he writes pretty much the same thing as Roger of Howden had done, so I'm not going to bother reading it out because it's pretty much the same passage, but obviously the translation is slightly different and the words are moved around a little bit. But yeah, those were pretty much 6 primary sources where they first mentioned King David. So I thought that was quite something different to add to the podcast, where the subject I'm talking about appears first in the sources. So I might carry on with that in the future because it was actually quite fun tracking it all down. So that covers that section, and now I'll move on to the next part, which is what I think of King David and the reasons why I've decided to talk about him. And it really boils down to the fact that I just enjoy the story of King David and what he did during his reign. So the fact that he was one of the youngest boys of a king who had in total 9 sons, and the fact that he became king, but not only that, but he transformed Scotland and built upon the successes of his brother Alexander, built many places like Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, founding towns and cities across Scotland, inviting people in, swelling Scotland's population numbers, so inviting in the Flemish, who always seemed to appear in Britain during the Middle Ages, because his reign is credited as the Davidian Revolution, which encompasses not only just his reign, but his brothers and his successors, really transforming Scotland into a sort of modern medieval kingdom, and politically being able to control parts of northern England for a while, because, spoiler alert, King David died at Carlisle Castle. Carlisle Castle still stands today. It's a very important castle in British history because it acted as sort of a buffer zone between England and Scotland. Like, if the Scots ever invaded, one of the first targets they would go for was Carlisle. And in fact, Carlisle was owned by Scotland for a time when they had conquered the Kingdom of Strathclyde. So it's a really important place. It's the castle itself isn't as medieval as it once obviously was, because obviously castles change, especially Carlisle, because it was on the centre point, as I said, between England and Scotland. So there are parts of it now where it's still medieval, like you can still potentially go into one of the rooms that I think King David may have died in. But when I went a few years ago, it had been altered so much that you couldn't really recognise it as much of a medieval castle as it would have been. Which, given the political climate and conflicts over the centuries, I'm not going to complain too much that it's not a medieval castle. Like, I'm not going to whinge like, oh, it's not like a medieval castle like Goodrich. It's still a really good castle to go to, and Carlisle itself was quite nice. The cathedral's quite cool there. I mean, I went up there to walk Hadrian's Wall, so I spent the day in Carlisle. In fact, I went there during the king's coronation, so it was full of people just getting absolutely pissed, getting absolutely trolleyed. So it was an interesting experience for someone who doesn't drink alcohol. But quickly going back to Holyrood Abbey, which David founded because he had a vision of founding this place, is the Black Rood, which is a famous relic of Scotland, which was brought by Margaret from Austria. Apparently was adored by David, and as their deaths, it was believed to contain a portion of the cross of Christ, so a holy relic, which probably would be fake, most likely. There's a lot of relics that claim to have a piece of the true cross, but I'm skeptical of all those claims. But going back to some of the places that King David founded, you can still visit them. Obviously, the Holyrood Abbey is a ruins now, unfortunately, but there are still a lot of places that David founded that you can still visit. Like, he certainly left his mark in Edinburgh as well, because he developed the castle heavily there. And what you'll find if you do research King David is the fact that he did found so many places. Like, I'm literally just quickly flicking through the early sources of Scottish history at the moment, which contains different chronicles depicting or talking about Scottish history. And you've got the Chronicle of Melrose, as I mentioned earlier, the Chronicle of Man, which basically just talks about the Abbey of St. Mary was founded. In the same year, this church was founded. So David did a lot of religious activity. He was a very spiritual king, as obviously most medieval kings were, but David was the exception, just for the fact that he founded just so many religious institutions, but then also populated them with different monks from different communities. But you'll most famously hear of King David when the civil war in England and Normandy, known as the Anarchy, is kicking off, which David appears heavily in. He was there for the Rout of Winchester, where he was fleeing with his niece, the Empress Matilda, and her prize commander, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, was captured. But before that, King Stephen had been captured during the Battle of Lincoln. So as soon as King Henry had died, King David took advantage quite heavily of the chaos, where he basically forced Stephen to meet him and gain control of some lands in the north of England, especially Carlisle, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, reading one of the last parts of the Chronicle of Melrose, which mentions David, it reads, David was king in Scotland for 29 years, wearily disconcerting what was provident. After he had fortified the kingdom with castles and arms, the king is said to have died an old man at Carlisle, which I think is quite a wonderful thing to say about a medieval king. Dying an old man is probably the best thing you could do as a medieval king, as long as you can hope that your succession is smooth, which for David, it wasn't 100% smooth, because his son Henry had died about a year before he had, so he had two young grandsons who eventually would take over, one of them being William the Lion, one of the longest ruling kings of Scotland. Now we come to the hard part of the podcast, for me at least, which is trying to gauge the public perception about King David, which, as King David is a Scottish king, I'm not familiar with the Scottish education system in regards to history, so I don't know whether or not kids in Scotland are taught about King David, because the problem with British history, especially, in Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland, you've got so much history to cover, from the earliest foundations of the kingdoms, colonialism, the civil wars, political climate, foundation of historical sites. There is so much history to talk about in Britain that it's actually quite hard to condense it. So when I was at school, it was Henry VIII, the Norman Conquest, 1920s America for some bizarre reason. I don't know why. And then a few other bits and bobs in between. So there wasn't really a hard focus on the medieval kings, unless it was like, the big ones like Henry VIII or Henry II, that sort of thing. So it's woefully inappropriate for me to try and guess what Scotland's educational system would talk about when it comes to their history, because, again, they have a similar problem as England. They've got a lot of big, famous kings. I mean, they've got all the Jameses to talk about, or Malcolm III, or Macbeth, so Macbeth, say his name and something bad will happen to you. Although looking at the data that I had from the last podcast where I could see who the popular kings were, David doesn't really come across much in that tier. I think the issue is as well is because his story hasn't really been told in a big way. And of course, the way they would tell a story today now is a television show or a big movie, because the most famous movie that depicts medieval Scotland is Braveheart, which is an entertaining movie and is a fun movie to watch, but it's just so woefully inaccurate and just overplayed on certain parts that just come across now as just a little bit cringe. So David doesn't really appear a lot in television and movies. I mean, I have had a look and I just can't seem to find hardly anything where he's been featured in, unless I'm wrong and you guys want to tell me in the comments. I mean, I did miss out a few things when I spoke about Henry II, but I felt like, mention the big ones and you'll find like the Lion in Winter is probably the most famous film Henry appears in. But for David, there's no really film or movie or TV show about him, because he's kind of wrapped up in the anarchy, which has been covered, not very well, I will add, but it has been covered. And in that kind of scenario, I can see filmmakers or TV producers kind of putting David in a very minor supporting role, even though he was quite prominent in the anarchy. He was there to help his niece, and he played King Stephen quite well, getting the agreements of him, especially gaining Carlisle, because I said the important castle at Carlisle he controlled and expanded, so he didn't just sit there and do nothing with Carlisle. He greatly expanded the fortifications on it. There is, however, quite a few news articles written about King David, which I'll list in the description on the YouTube version. And there's also a few radio programs where they talk about him and the Davidian Revolution, like on BBC Radio 4. So he is in discussion, but I think unless, a big TV budget show comes along or a big movie, I don't think King David is going to be represented much in the future. And again, going forward in terms of video games, he obviously does appear in the Crusader Kings franchises. Now, I have Crusader Kings 2 and Crusader Kings 3, and there's quite a difference between King David in both games. And the trait system, which is obviously one of the prominent parts of the Crusader Kings series, it seems like they really just didn't know what to give King David. I can understand where they're coming from, because they've got a lot of characters to go over and historical characters, and they can't probably give an historical assessment for them all. But they gave King David rather odd traits, which I've, from my time researching him, I was just like, what are they going for here? So I'll give you an example. Let's start with Crusader Kings 2, and the one trait they gave him was shy. I don't know where they got that from. From what I've read of all the accounts, there's no way David was shy. He was a very active king, even as his time as Prince of the Cumbrians. He was doing the typical, medieval monarch thing of traveling around his kingdom a lot. So him being shy, there's no evidence. I've not read anything that could come across as him being shy. He went into battle during the Battle of the Standard. Fair enough, he lost that battle, but he led his armies in on a campaign. He was in Winchester during the Rout of Winchester. So him being shy, there's just no evidence for it. So I don't know where they got that from. However, I will give them credit. The game does give him the trait of just, which does match his character. He did implement new laws and is seen as a law-abiding and law-governing king. One of the other traits I disagree with is underhanded rogue, because you could really swap that out for political intelligence, which, as I've mentioned, King David had in abundance. There was a reason he managed to secure Carlisle from King Stephen during a tumultuous time, and then also get further agreements down the line. But then not only just in the north of England, but also in parts of Scotland that weren't really under his jurisdiction, because at this point in time, quite a bit of Scotland and the Isles, the Outer Hebrides, the Inner Hebrides, were owned by the Kingdom of the Isles, which at times was a semi-independent kingdom or under the thumb of the Norwegian king. So David had to contend with that. So him being politically intelligent should easily be a trait that King David had. Although quickly going back to the Kingdom of the Isles in Crusader Kings 2, it technically doesn't exist in the game. It's shown on the map you can see on the YouTube version that it's owned by Norway completely, as opposed to the Kingdom of the Isles. However, if we then jump over to Crusader Kings 3, it is formed as the Kingdom of the Isles. And in Crusader Kings 3, King David is given a whole different set of traits. Some of them, again, I disagree with. Some of them I agree with, so we'll quickly go over that. At the point in the game I have, because I don't have all the DLC, King David is dead because you can only choose certain start dates, but you can look over his character traits. And one trait they gave him was gluttonous. Now, how did they get gluttonous from? Because King David was an old man, as the Chronicle of Marrow says, and we know he was an old man. Gluttonous people who, it implies they're obese or whatever, don't tend to live long into old age. So him being gluttonous doesn't really make sense. Again, in all the chronicles I've read and the book by David Oram, which I'll go over the sources in a moment, none of them mention David's appetite, whether he enjoyed anything. I mean, famously, his patron and his teacher, King Henry I, died from eating too many lampreys. That was the famous tale of how he died. Like, his physician warned him not to eat so many lampreys, and Henry was like, no, I love these things, I'm going to carry on eating them, and then he gets a stomach disease or something and dies. So, don't know where they got gluttonous from. Maybe it's just a trait they thought they'd just give him because his patron was gluttonous. I don't know. Another one the game gives him is naive appeaser. Where did they get that from? Again, King David, very politically intelligent. Got Carlisle off King Stephen. I just don't know what they're basing that particular trait on, because there's no way in which David was seen as a naive appeaser. I mean, the only thing I can think of is towards the end of his reign, where his hard work in securing some of the Isles was completely undone by an invasion by the Norwegian king, which set back the work he had been progressing towards completely from the start again. So again, I'm not too sure where they get naive appeaser from. I shouldn't get so annoyed by these, but I'm like, there's got to be justification for it. If I had to give a negative trait to King David, maybe pride. Just if you read some of the chroniclers in the way that King David announces himself coming to Carlisle might imply pride. That's one way I would justify it. I don't know why Naive Interpreter has vexed me so much. When I played it and I saw that, I don't know why it just really annoyed me, because it was like, there's no justification for giving King David that trait. Anyway, I'm rambling on about this for too long, ironically. I will give Crusader Kings 3 credit for giving him the brave trait, which most medieval kings or successful ones had to be, which we know King David was because he invaded England so many times at the start of King Stephen's reign and, of course, during the Battle of the Standard. So brave is a very worthwhile trait to give to King David. Now we come to the final part of the podcast where I talk about what sources you can read if you did want to research King David. So they'll be in the description of the YouTube video version of this podcast. But one book that is prominent about David is by Richard Oram. This is the only book I found that is a biography of King David, although he says in the book is not, nor was it intended to be an attempt of a definitive study of Scotland in the reign of David I, for that would require a far larger work than is intended for this series. The focus of this book, by the author's own words, is the king, his achievements, and his failures. And if you would like to read this book or sample it, you can read it on Internet Archive, which again, I'll put the links in the description down below. Very worth a good read, was very helpful in my studies of King David, especially when I was creating the video, because the way I do my research, I've explained it before, but I look at the primary sources first, then I look at the interpretations by historians. And as this is the only book by a historian on King David that I found, very worth a read. Very, very good. Really enjoyed reading it. Richard Oram has done a lecture on YouTube, which I'll also link in the video description, where he talks about revolution under King David as well. So I'll link that. That one, again, is very much worth a listen. Most of the sources I have used when I researched this particular podcast, and obviously in the past when I did my video series on David I, most of them you can easily read online on Internet Archive, and the next one is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Again, I don't need to mention that one. That one should be fairly obvious. That one you can read online. There's loads of different translations of it. I have the one that is translated by Michael Swanton, which my friend Josh, who is an academic doing his PhD at the moment, recommended to me. So very much a very good read. There's also the Early Sources of Scottish History, Volume 2. That was edited by Alan Orr Anderson. Again, it's an old book, I believe, from the 1900s. So my version may not be up to date, but it basically comprises of all of the annals that involve Scottish history. So it not only mentions, like I said, the Chronicle of Melrose, but it will mention some others that mention Scotland in their writings, like John of Worcester, for example. Again, that is available to read on Internet Archive, so that's really useful if you're researching early Scottish history. There's also some other books that I've used. The Chronicles I mentioned at the start, Henry of Huntingdon, John of Worcester, Aldrich Vitalis, Roger of Howden, Roger of Wendover as well was one I forgot to mention. And then some other books that were relating to King David's reign that I have read over the years. There was Catherine Henley's Matilda. There was Donald Matthews' King Stephen. Again, I believe these are available to read on Internet Archive if you wanted to. History of a Nation by Lowman Books. Didn't really read that much one because it was more of a summary account of the history of Scotland. But yeah, there's plenty of resources available that you can read for the reign of King David. The early life of King David, because he was the son of a king who had 9 sons. David's early start is kind of obscure to find. And you'll find that when you read some of the books, they all just say, yeah, the early years of King David are quite obscure because he was an obscure figure. Until his sister married the King of England, he doesn't really come up much. And then eventually he does when he's gifted the land in Cumbria. And then eventually when he becomes King of Scotland, that's when we get more from his reign. And with that concludes the podcast. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to me rambling on. The next episode will be the 5th one. Again, I'll put out a poll to decide on what king's next for April. Although in April, I am going to be quite busy because the community has also voted for a top 10 worst kings of England and top 10 best kings of England video. So that's probably going to keep me busy. And next week, in the first week of April, it's supposed to be nice weather, so I'm hopefully going to go out and try and do some more filming. So anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed listening to me rambling on, and I'll see you next time. So thanks again, guys. Bye-bye.